Welcome along, fellow time travelers. This time around, I'm going to share the story of the Grumpy Dumpy. This is part 1. The story of the Grumpy Dumpy is from Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, an anti-fairy tale. So, sit back and pour yourself a cup of coffee, or a tankard of tea, or a mug of mead, or a chalice of cider, or a flagon, filled with any beverage of your choice, and join me around the campfire. Would you like to go to a party with me? If so, then let's travel back in time to the spring of 2016. You see, Amber Heard's 30th birthday was on April 22nd of that year. Now, because she was going to Coachella on that day, she decided that the night before, on April 21st, she would have dinner with her friends at Johnny Depp's penthouse. Amber had a friend named Rocky, and Rocky had a boyfriend who was a gentleman named Josh Drew. And he was some sort of chef, so he asked Amber what he would like for him to cook for her. And she told him to make Mexican food. That was her favorite. Now, on that day, Mr. Starling Jenkins III was working security for Johnny Depp. At that time, he was an executive chauffeur and security personnel, and he worked as Johnny Depp's driver and bodyguard. He was in the command post that was stationed on the same floor as Johnny Depp's penthouses. You see, it was located right outside of the elevators. Earlier in the day, in preparation for the party, Mr. Jenkins interacted with Amber in regards to getting her keys and parking and making sure that no one else was on the floor unless they were invited to the party. Thankfully, Mr. Jenkins did not have any security issues that evening. And that was mainly because his boss, Johnny Depp, did not show up while Mr. Jenkins was on shift. And he left sometime close to 11 o'clock. Now let's talk about April 21st. The reason why Johnny Depp was late for the party was because Johnny was in a room for many hours with a group of his new accountants. You see, they were going through the situation that Johnny was in financially, which was a real shock to him. Johnny had no idea how bad his financial circumstances were. Many people will think this sounds ridiculous, but Johnny always preferred to think of the work that he was doing as an actor as opposed to how much he was getting paid for being an actor. So, he had no idea how much money he had made during his career. He just figured, if he was working, there would be money, and so everything would just be all right. Well, Johnny's new accountants informed him that quite an inordinate amount of money was gone. Yeah, it had disappeared. And this was incredible to find out when one considers that Johnny Depp had worked 30-something years in the entertainment industry in Los Angeles. Check this out. Johnny apparently lost over $650 million that he had made during his career. And to make matters worse, he owed another $100 million in taxes, thanks to the alleged mismanagement from his former business managers. So as you can imagine, Johnny was pretty shocked to learn where he was financially. And needless to say, it was a very long meeting. The man who was in charge of explaining most of this to Johnny was Mr. Edward White. Many years ago, he founded Edward White & Company, certified public accountants. He was the managing and senior partner of the firm. As you likely know, a certified public accounting firm is authorized to audit financial information and to certify the related statements. The nature of the work that was done at Edward White & Company at the time was quite diversified. It included providing tax and related compliance services to do the tax returns for their clients. Now, Mr. Depp was introduced to Mr. White by Mr. Richard Smith, who, at the time, was a senior executive at the Bank of California. Soon after their first meeting, Johnny hired Edward White & Company to be his business management firm. That involved managing his financial affairs and relegating his financial activities to Mr. White and his colleagues. Their firm was quite reputable, and they had already been doing this with numerous other clients. Initially, Johnny hired them to perform a kind of forensic study to evaluate his financial affairs and to formulate recommendations on how he could manage his affairs in a more advantageous manner. After they conducted that analysis, Mr. White arranged to meet with Mr. Depp, the purpose of which was to share with him the results of their findings and to make recommendations in how he could resolve the issues that he was confronting. That meeting was on April 21st of 2016. Mr. White called the meeting because he felt it was appropriate to meet with Mr. Depp and to discuss his affairs and to provide him with opportunities and plans and strategies to resolve the issues that he was confronting. The meeting was held at Johnny's production offices in Los Angeles. It began at approximately 7:30 p.m., and there were 7 people in attendance, including Mr. Depp and Mr. White. Johnny, as you can imagine, was very interested in the contents. He asked very thoughtful questions. He was fully engaged and fully sensitive to the matters that the accountants were discussing. During the meeting, Johnny had a glass of wine, along with the others in attendance, since a bottle had been brought in for them to share. During this entire meeting, Johnny knew, of course, that Miss Heard's birthday dinner was to start at, he believed, 8:30 or so. And so he did excuse himself on 2, I think maybe even 3 occasions to text her. And he wrote such things as, "This is probably going to go long, and I think I might be a little late. I'm sorry, but it's important, and I'm going to be a little late for the dinner." Johnny made sure he addressed the fact that this was an extremely important meeting that involved his financial viability, and that he felt it was imperative to stay and address the issues that were being discussed with him. At the conclusion of the meeting, at around 9:30 p.m., Johnny thanked Mr. White and the others profusely for not only addressing the issues but formulating a strategy and plan to resolve them in a successful manner. Johnny, accompanied by Mr. Sean Bett, was then driven to his house on Sweetser to pick up the gift he had gotten for Amber. Now, as you may already know, Sean Bett was, at the time, Johnny's bodyguard. Previously, he was with the L.A. County Sheriff's Department for just over 14 years. During that time, he was assigned to the custody division, where he handled the intake and outtake of inmates. Then he was assigned to the patrol division, where he was assigned to crime units. After that, he was assigned to gang details, where he focused in saturated and certain areas within his district on gang shootings and things of that nature. He would perform search warrants and other stuff like that. He also worked with homicide, working with special enforcement bureaus to combat a lot of the crime that was taking place in his area. Unfortunately, Mr. Bett was in a couple of really bad traffic collisions, and during the course of duties, the County of Los Angeles issued what they called a medical retirement, or a discharge. And so he was kind of forced out based on his injuries. And so after he left the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, he was doing some private investigations, and he was also doing security, estate security at various residences and offices, and working with different executives on certain details. Mr. Bett worked with a certain clientele that ranged from CEOs, VPs of Fortune 500 companies, and certain types of celebrities as well. During the course of working estate security and private security, he was asked if he was available to work the estate of Mr. Johnny Depp. And he, of course, said yes, on a part-time basis at the time. This was at the end of either 2006 or maybe even in the beginning of 2007, around that time. And since that time, he had been employed exclusively by Mr. Depp. His general responsibilities was mostly estate security, so he controlled the people who arrived at the estate. He would monitor the streets to make sure there were no overzealous fans or paparazzi that would hop over fences or would try to sneak in through bushes and take pictures of Johnny's family. His job also entailed taking the kids or the kids' mother to school or shopping or out to dinner, things of that nature. He then started to travel a little bit more with Johnny out of state, and then eventually he traveled with Johnny out of the country and worldwide. But when he was in town, if Mr. Bett wasn't with Johnny's children, taking them around to school and so forth, he would be around Johnny and provide security for him when he went out and about in public and so forth. And so Mr. Bett had access to Johnny at any given time. He had an open-door policy. He had access to his residence, the inside, all the rooms at any given time in the event there was an emergency or anything like that. When traveling with Johnny, Mr. Bett had access to his hotel rooms in case there was an emergency. Now, for the most part, Mr. Bett's responsibilities evolved to provide security for Johnny and his well-being, whether that was in a hotel or a residence or when he was out and about in public. When in the United States, Mr. Bett was Johnny's lead security guy. But there were others involved also in Johnny Depp's security. So, for example, they included Malcolm Connolly, who primarily did his European security. You also had Mr. Leonard Damian and Mr. Mark Gibbs and Mr. Travis McGiven. You also had Mr. Starling Jenkins III, and Mr. Jerry Judge used to be Johnny's chief security individual. He was with him for well over 20 years before, sadly, he passed away from cancer. Over the course of the time that he worked for Johnny, Mr. Sean Bett saw Johnny intoxicated many times. And he kind of described him as being sort of, too cool for school. He would get into that kind of Jack Sparrow mode, and was very likable. Johnny Depp was very low-key and easy to get along with when he was intoxicated and when he wasn't intoxicated. In the early days of his relationship with Amber, Mr. Sean Bett would be at Johnny's estate when she and her sister, Whitney Heard, her good friend Rocky Pennington, and another friend, Io Tillett Wright, and Miss Pennington's boyfriend at the time, Josh Drew, were constantly coming around the estate. Mr. Bett was there when Johnny eventually let a couple of them live in his penthouses downtown for free. Mr. Bett was there when Johnny would let Amber's friends drive his nice Dodge Challenger in and around town and to take on trips. Mr. Bett observed how Amber's friends and family treated Johnny. They were obviously very pleasant to him because, well, based on Mr. Bett's observation, they were taking advantage of him. So they were being obviously extra nice to the hand that fed them. And that just progressed over a period of time. Mr. Bett was also there to witness many of the times that Amber argued with Johnny. During many of those times, Mr. Bett would put Johnny in the car and they would drive back to his West Hollywood address. Depending upon the day, or the week, or the month, Johnny and Amber would reconcile within hours, or it might take a day where he would stay overnight at his West Hollywood address. And then he would take him back the next day, and he and Amber would reconcile by talking. And she would have, candles lit or a bottle of wine open with glasses. On certain evenings, Mr. Bett would get a text message from Amber asking him to go pick up dinner at local restaurants that they frequented. Mr. Bett was working for Johnny in March of 2015. And it was during that time when he saw that Johnny had a swollen cheekbone and eyelid. And so Mr. Bett took a photograph in case it was needed as evidence, in case Miss Heard tried to make allegations towards Mr. Depp. And then around December of 2015, according to Mr. Bett, Amber scratched up Johnny. He had scratch marks around his nose area, and on one side of his face, and in the cheek area, and on his forehead. Meanwhile, Mr. Bett never did see any similar injuries on Miss Heard. Miss Heard never told Mr. Bett that she was being abused by Mr. Depp. She never asked Mr. Bett for any help, and Mr. Bett never saw any evidence that Ms. Heard was being abused by Mr. Depp. And so while on his way downtown, Johnny received a text from Amber asking if he would bring some wine and some weed. Johnny texted back, "Sure." So he had to go and do that for her. And by the time he arrived downtown at the Eastern Columbia building and walked through the lobby and took the elevator to the top floor and walked through the long hallways and arrived at Penthouse 5 for the party, he was about an hour and 40 minutes late. And so once Johnny and Mr. Bett entered the front door to the penthouse, Amber stood up. She walked towards Johnny. She had a look of, you could tell she was upset at the fact that he was late. Mr. Depp apologized to everybody. He apologized to Amber, and, he told her, "Sorry, baby," or words to that effect, for being late. She gave him a hug and a kiss and said,
"Come on, sit down, sugar."
That is a nickname that Amber used to call Johnny.
"Sugar. Hey, sugar. Nice to see you, sugar. How you doing, sugar? Hey, sugar. Come here, sugar. Sugar."
Rather than being happy to see her husband, Amber was very cold to Johnny. Mr. Bett had a couple of Johnny's computer bags and other bags with him, and so he just set them down in the corner and then exited. Mr. Bett then stayed nearby for another hour or two until he was relieved by the night shift security personnel, Travis McGivern. During the party, Amber barely spoke to Johnny in front of the others, though occasionally she would tear herself from the conversation that she was in and just lean towards him. He was sitting to her right, and he would get a quick earful of,
"I can't believe you've done this to me on my birthday. I can't believe it. I'm so embarrassed."
Johnny found this to be odd, because he kept her informed all day that he was running late, and that he would be late, and he would have been there sooner had she not sent that text asking him to go and get some wine and marijuana for her and her friends. So, when Johnny got there and received that attitude, what could he do? So he just made the best of it and talked to her friends. Among those who were there was Nurse Erin Borum, who had been a nurse assigned to Amber. Johnny had conversations with the various people at the party, including Amber's makeup artist, Melanie Iglesias, and she was there with her fella, and Johnny spoke French with them, and he didn't really eat. He just kind of wasn't feeling it. Amber, by the way, was well into the wine before Johnny got there. Johnny had maybe 2 glasses of wine. They were large, the large sort of Bordeaux glasses. By the time the party started to wind down, as parties often do, one person would say, "Well, I better get out of here." And then 2 or more couples or 2 more couples would say, "Yeah, time to go." And then just wind down. And so soon, Mr. Drew, Miss Pennington, Amber's sister Whitney, and everybody else had left. And that was when Amber began to commence with her usual verbal barrage. Johnny tried to block most of it out. To him, it just sounded like
blah, 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 blah.
And that was because, at that point, there was so much in Johnny's head from the meeting. He thought it was a bit much, and it seemed quite brattish and childish that Amber was holding such a grudge against Johnny for having been late to her birthday party when she knew very well and was informed that he was in an intense meeting that had a lot to do with not just his life and his future, but his children's. And he didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know if houses were going to start going away because perhaps he would have been forced to sell them. And so, even though She was upset about him being late to a party. It felt unfair and small, comparatively, since her husband had some pretty serious issues brought before him prior to the party. So, when she engaged in her normal kind of banter of trying to poke at him and get him to react, he literally walked away from her, went into his bedroom, and went to bed. The television was on. He was reading. Amber was down in her area, taking off her makeup and changing into sleep clothes or whatever she was doing, and then she entered the bedroom. Johnny was laying on his side of the bed, reading. And she stomped over and started rattling off all the wrongs that she thought he had done to her on that particular day. She rattled off about how unreliable he was. She rattled off about what a horrible person he was. She then got into the bed and continued rattling on. Blah, 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 blah. Johnny did not engage verbally. Johnny did not engage at all. Johnny did nothing. He simply stayed where he was, reading his book. And when she didn't get a jump out of him or a jolt out of him, Amber got out of the bed. Stomp, 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 stomp. She made her way around the bed. She went over to his side. She stood in front of him. And she started hitting her husband in the face, at his head, at his neck, at anything that she could hit. And to protect himself, Johnny finally had to get out of the bed. He turned and he grabbed his wife by the shoulders and he sat her down on the bed and he said, I'm leaving. Please, don't get off the bed. Please, don't follow me. Please, don't try and stop me. I'm leaving. I'm leaving. Johnny then turned and began to leave his bedroom. Furious, her face piping hot, Amber got out of the bed, and she caught up and she squared off at him in the doorway of their bedroom. And Johnny said, "What do you want to do? Hit me again? Would you like to hit me again?" She was a powder keg, ready to explode. And so he said, "Go ahead. Hit me." Bam! She hit him again. Johnny stood there and took the assault. He then said, Is that what you wanted? Would you like another?" Bam! There was a second one. She hit him again. Wow. Amber Heard physically assaulted her husband again. Imagine what kind of person does that to their spouse. Johnny once again stood there and took the assault. And then he said, "Good. Now, you're done?" He once again grabbed her by the shoulders, walked her to the bed, sat her down and said, Don't follow me. Leave me alone. I'm out. I'm gone." Johnny then turned and went to grab a few things. And he left his penthouse. And at 4:30 a.m., he had his driver take him to his home on Sweetser. At this point, obviously, it is April 22nd of 2016. And so, about 6 hours after Johnny left at 10:45 a.m., Mr. Jenkins arrived for work, and he went upstairs to Penthouse 3. He was immediately informed by Amber that she got into a fight with Johnny the night before. she told Mr. Jenkins that she threw his personal property over the balcony and it landed down in the streets. This included Johnny's phone and Johnny's wallet, which included his credit cards and everything else that one would keep in their wallet. She also threw over his passport. Mr. Jenkins then formulated a plan with Norm from the office to use the Find My Phone app and then to go down and hit the streets and try to get lucky. Thankfully, Mr. Jenkins did end up finding Mr. Depp's phone on Skid Row. An unhoused gentleman had it. He was honest, and he returned it. Mr. Jenkins gave him a reward for it, which included $420, as well as chicken tacos, chips, apples, and Fiji water. After finding Johnny's phone, Mr. Jenkins returned to the penthouse. He showed Amber that he had retrieved it, and he left it in the security office for the evening security to return to Johnny. While he was doing that, Amber had packed her bags for the trip that she was going to take to Coachella. As you may know, the Coachella Valley Music and Arts Festival is an annual music and arts festival held at the Empire Polo Club in Indio, California, in the Coachella Valley, southeast of Palm Springs. Amber looked around Penthouse 3. Johnny Depp's penthouse was incredible. And there she was, living off of his hard work. Under what other circumstances could she possibly have ever found herself in such luxurious surroundings? And what did she have to do to be there? Simply appeal to an incredibly wealthy and famous man and agree to marry him. And what did she have to do in order to have that penthouse and anything and everything else she could have ever wanted in her life? All Amber had to do was be kind and romantic and loving and honest and caring and faithful, and to keep to the vows she made when she got married. But something, somewhere, deep in her mind or in the chemicals of her body, something, nobody seems to know what, stopped Amber from doing that. For reasons unknown, she wasn't able to do those things for him. Was she the antithesis of a good person because of Johnny? What did he do to cause her to constantly be screaming at him and hitting at him? Well, it couldn't have been his doing because it has been said that she yelled and hit at others too. Maybe Amber Heard was simply the type of person who was so self-centered that all she cared about was consuming anything and everything around her, sucking the life out of whatever came her way and digesting it for her own use, and then defecating out whatever she didn't want or need. She wouldn't be the first person to be a user. She wouldn't be the first person to abuse others. And so, it would not be so unusual if you, yes you, the person listening to this story right now, if you were in the penthouse with Amber Heard at the time, as she stomped up the stairs and then turned and walked into the beautiful bedroom she shared with Johnny Depp, and she took off her shirt and threw it to the floor, and removed her bra and threw it to the floor, and then unbuttoned her jeans and pushed them down to the floor, and then stepped out of them, and then slid off her underwear, and stood in front of the tall glass windows of the penthouse at the top of the Eastern Columbia building. In the distance, she heard music blasting from the speakers in the walls, and an MGMT song began to play. Yes, Amber Heard sucked in everything around her. All the oxygen, all the life, all of everything she could. Like the concoction of Mexican food she consumed the night before. All of the rice and all of the beans. If you were near Amber Heard, you may very well have been stabbed with a fork and put on her tongue. That is because to Amber Heard, you would have been nothing but fuel to get her where she would want to go. And so, if Amber Heard ate you, she would have begun by chewing your flesh, which would have been positioned by her cheek and her tongue and between her teeth for grinding. As you know, chewing, or mastication, is the process by which food is crushed and ground by teeth. Chewing on your flesh would have stimulated saliva production in Amber Heard's mouth and would have increased her sensory perception of what she was eating. And as she would continue chewing, your flesh would have been made softer and warmer, and the enzymes in her saliva would have begun to break down carbohydrates into sugars. Since, as you know, digestion begins in the mouth, it would be very important that Amber chew on your flesh slowly, rather than just gulping, or as some would say, wolfing down your flesh. And so after chewing on you for a while, Amber would have then swallowed. And while all of the above was happening, you will have heard a loud grumbling sound. And you wouldn't have been too sure if it was coming from within her stomach or the music blasting through the speakers in the penthouse. But you would have heard the lyrics as MGMT sang, "I'm feeling rough, I'm feeling raw, I'm in the prime of my life. Let's make some music, make some money, find some models for wives." And while that song played, your flesh would have entered Amber's esophagus as muscular contractions massaged the ball of food down and then continued on to her stomach, where the next step of digestion would have occurred. And at this point, you will have passed through a small muscle ring into Amber Heard's stomach, and it is there where your flesh will have mixed with her gastric juices. And once in her stomach, you will have been churned mechanically and chemically, and then you would have been squeezed through a tube and into the first part of her small intestine. And at this point, your remains will have mixed with more digestive enzymes from Amber's pancreas and bile from her liver. You will then have been squeezed into the lower parts of Amber's small intestine. Nutrients from your flesh will then have been absorbed from a portion of the small intestine, which is lined, by the way, with millions of finger-like projections. Each is connected to a mesh of capillaries. This is how nutrients from your remains will have passed into Amber's bloodstream, and your remains will have been consumed in digestive juices while her pancreas would secrete a hormone called insulin to help regulate the amount of sugar in Amber's blood. And at this point, your remains will have entered Amber's liver in order to break down fats using bile stored in her gallbladder, process proteins and carbohydrates, filter and process impurities, drugs and toxins, and generate glucose for short-term energy needs from other compounds like lactate and amino acids. Once all the nutrients were absorbed, the waste will then have moved into Amber's large intestine. Water will then have been removed, and waves of muscular contraction in the walls of Amber's colon will then have moved the fecal matter through her digestive tract towards her rectum, where it would have been stored. And as the waste filled Amber Heard's rectum and expanded her rectal walls, stretch receptors in her rectal walls would have stimulated the desire for her to defecate. And so, when Amber's rectum was full, an increase in pressure within her rectum forced apart the walls of Amber's anal canal, allowing the fecal matter to enter the canal. Her rectum would then have shortened as the waste material was forced into her anal canal, and the waves will have pushed the feces out of Amber's rectum. Amber's internal and external anal tube would have allowed the feces to be passed by muscles pulling her anus up over the feces exiting Amber. And at this point, what remained of you and everything else that Amber Heard had consumed recently fell to the part of the bed where Johnny Depp, her husband, would sleep. Yes, Amber Heard defecated out in the open, like a wild animal in the woods, rather than using the toilet like a mentally stable human being would. And then she stood up, victorious, and looked around at everything she had, knowing she was probably going to lose it pretty soon, unless she could manipulate Johnny even further. And at that point, we can assume that Amber stepped off the bed, put her bra back on, and then her shirt, and then her underwear, and then pulled on her pants, left the bedroom, walked downstairs, grabbed her luggage, and walked out of the door of the penthouse. And so this concludes part 1 of this episode of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, an anti-fairy tale, and the story of the Grumpy Dumpy. If you have any other stories that you would like told concerning this anti-fairy tale, including any of the times that Amber Heard verbally or physically assaulted Johnny Depp, please list those in the comments below. If you have any thoughts about this subject matter, please put those in the comments below and share what's on your mind. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, kindly give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel. I've also written a whole bunch of books on architectural history and stuff like that, so if you're interested in something called books, jump on over to Amazon, type up Scott Cardinal. I've written books about the Dakota, the Ansonia, Friar Park, stuff like that. You might enjoy them. I'd also appreciate it if you could become a member of my channel. At this point, the lowest tier is only $12 a year. That helps me finance these productions, and it encourages me to produce more of them. And there's also some other links below in the description for ways to make donations or to access my website. Please go ahead and do that. I would appreciate it. Please kindly do yourself a favor and go to a local shelter and adopt a cat or a dog or another furry friend. You'll be very glad that you did. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.